Right, we're about to start the next section, which begins at page 57 and concludes at 66. So let's get straight to it. In the beginning of this section, there's descriptions of the natives' land, or descriptions of the New South Wales coastline and the New South Wales environment. There's a sense of strangeness that's echoed in the descriptions, and there's some beautiful setting paragraphs here that you could analyse, particularly if you're thinking about preparing for a topic of the sense of place. The foreignness is emphasised with this quote, "The dialogue of a fugue from another world." And the description here is of how Rook might describe the rocks to Anne, and he compares them to a French pastry that they ate together. Then we have the prisoners who begin to hack away at the bushes and trees. So there's a description of the convicts here, and some imagery of the 800 convicts to 200 Marines. And he says that the mathematics of control were precarious. They are quite outnumbered. The Marines are outnumbered. And the precariousness of the situation is reflected in the natural environment and the roughness, I guess, the wildness of the natural environment. So note that in your setting descriptions as well. There were a few more characters that are introduced. Captain Gosden, there is, Major Wyatt as well. Yep. On page 60, there's a description of the heat. Don't forget that the First Fleet arrived on the 26th of January, the day we celebrate Australia Day. So it is hot. It's in the middle of summer, and you can imagine how they must have sweat into their English or Marines uniforms. So there's a contrast as well. So remember how one of the themes that we keep seeing is the theme of the different status or the difference. And here we have the red jackets, which are contrasted with the blue coats of the Navy. And this is like a formal regimented kind of occasion where they're all standing around for like an opening ceremony, and they all have to salute and pull the trigger of their musket. Can you imagine all of the Marines shooting off at once? And Rook has a moment's nausea at the time, and I just wrote PTSD. Because his memory of war is probably being triggered there. That's what I'm inferring anyway. He hopes that, it's February, not January there, but he hopes that it is the last time that he would ever fire it, which represents him as a peace lover, as a pacifist, somebody who values their state of peace. And James Gilbert becomes monarch by proxy, so he becomes the governor. Now Governor Gilbert. And interesting, there's people hawking and spitting when they hear the name of King George III. possibly indicating their resentment towards the king who has cast the convicts into the life of servitude, at least indentured servitude, for the next 7 years, 14 years, 21 years, however many years they were sentenced from. Governor Gilbert here proclaims the land of New South Wales to belong to His Majesty the King. The irony of that we understand because obviously we know now with our modern view that it belongs to the Indigenous people. They explain the size of the land, which is 2,000 miles by 800 miles east to west, so a large area. And this is a very important quote. I've got another star here. Governor Gilbert reads this speech, and the natives are on all occasions to be treated with amity and kindness. And of course, we also recognise the irony given how they were actually treated even on their first meeting, which is anything but amity and kindness. The shooting of the shield in half, the slightly mocking tone, despite the fact they're offering trinkets as a gesture of peace, the somewhat racist words that are used, and the lack of general respect that is offered. But this is an important quote. The irony here of the way that they are intended to be treated in comparison with how they actually are indeed. So it could be situational irony. I would just call it irony. And 61, there is this speech which continues that the importance of friendly intercourse, which just means conversation or interactions, relationship. People need to become familiar with the native tongue as quickly as possible. And now Rook realizes, hey, they don't just need an astronomer, but they also need a linguist. And given his linguistic abilities, he speaks 5 other languages. He now, that side of things kind of appears to him for the first time. Note that so far there had been no opportunity to show the natives amity and kindness, and the italics here demonstrating that irony. In other texts, they may be put into inverted commas, which would indicate the the ironic nature of that. And coming on to page 63, I guess, animosity between prisoners and the soldiers is hinted at, and Rook is gripping on his musket. Thankfully, all he has to do is look alert in this case once the prisoners start kind of shouting and whistling and reacting. Now, he realizes, though, that maybe he may have to act like every man in a red coat. All the Marines might have to react. But he's happy to be different from other Marines. On the voyage, he established his distinction, which is a separateness or difference from other Marines, and he must continue. So he points out this headland of the cove, like a remote place that might suit an observatory. So he's already scoping out the land for where he can be separate from others, and he's going to investigate, make sure that Lieutenant Rook is too busy with the stars, the celestial bodies, for any kind of terrestrial, earthly duty. And to conclude the ceremony, the Reverend reads from the Psalms. And page 64. Finishes with a benediction, blessing, and he aims for that promising bit of headland where he can put his own observatory. And there's an interaction here where Rook sees the Major Wyatts right here, he's actually seeing a prisoner being mistreated. And so basically the prisoners, or the convicts now, are chopping trees down. They're trying to clear land. And so there's a tall fellow, and he's wearing clothes that don't fit him, much too small for him. He's not avoiding being hit by Major Wyatt's stick, but he's not really able to have much impact on the tree. And so there's a description of like the lack of success with the clearing. And somebody else is clearing another stump, and there's basically general ineptitude, and Rook observes this, and also that it might be stupidity, but it might be indifference, that they don't really care about this task of clearing the ground. It's pointless, as punitive. And punitive, this word, is actually one that reoccurs. So just make a note of it for now. But it means punishment. So the task is punishment. So there's no heart or effort in it. And Rook thanks God that his passion for astronomy means that he's not actually in that position. Interesting. I didn't notice until now that Rook actually has a comparatively higher status in this. So he's both above and below in terms of his status in many situations. Anyway, then there's an interesting interaction with Silk, who is writing in his journal, writing in his notebook, or scribbling in his notebook. He describes that the natives didn't know what sex they were, and they burst into laughter when they finally understand. One of the sailors gave a visual demonstration. Basically, one of the sailors took down his pants to show them his private parts, and they just burst into laughter. And Rook sort of hopes that he doesn't get put into Silk's book. And we conclude this chapter here. So by describing that Gardner gave some fish to them yesterday, and here Silk asks for Rook's help with the writing. Well, not with the writing, but the telling of stories. So he can't be everywhere. So things you hear, you need to make sure you pass on to me so I can include them in my book, basically. He's trying to make his narrative a sparkling gem of a thing. So he recognises that this story really matters to Silk. And he realises that this isn't just 4 years of full pay, but actually is part of his destiny in the same way as it is for himself. And that is the end of this chapter.